One of my favorite game designers is John Theissen. This probably isn't a surprise since we published 5 of his games and we're about to publish another, which we'll get to in a hop and a skip. The games John has done for us are operational in their focus. A small handful of counters moving across a large map, trying to come to grips with the enemy or to avoid them. One of the keys to this, running through all his games, is the Retreat Before Combat mechanism, RBC. When you attack, your opponent has the opportunity to attempt RBC. They roll a die, and if it's a 3 or better, there's no battle. Pretty good chance of success. If I'm vastly outnumbered, I'm not just going to sit there and take it, I'm going to try to slip away. I'm only going to accept a battle I think I can win. Unless there's a piece of ground I absolutely can't give up. Woe to the commander that lets the enemy take their supply base. Or maybe I think the odds are closer to even. I'll never be sure because I don't know exactly how many strength points you have on your side. Just like you don't know how many I have on mine. That information is hidden until we've committed to a battle. And maybe if you're converging on my forces from multiple directions, you'll fail your coordination roll, getting a leftward column shift. Or maybe I'll succeed in my attempt to concentrate forces, turning what you thought was a slam dunk into a fierce contest. Or maybe none of that happens, my tiny force comes face to face with one that I know is going to wipe the floor with me, and I desperately want to skedaddle, but I just plain botch my RBC. Maybe that battle wipes me out, or maybe I emerge relatively unscathed. The CRT has a wide variety of results, including subtables, ranging from catastrophic to inconclusive. These might be mitigated by a roll on the defensive works table. Both sides might suffer additional casualties on the casualty table, which is determined by the size of the smaller force. And the thing that's an absolute marvel is that all of this sounds complicated. RBC, attacker coordination, defender concentration, the CRT roll, the defensive works roll, the casualty table roll. But it's not. It's clean, streamlined. It doesn't feel granular or fiddly. It feels pure, almost abstract. And yet they're very much games that center the history. John gives you the historical situation and gives you historical tools. Tools that can often be awkward to use. What you do with them is up to you. The game will only be as exciting and dynamic as you make it. John's previous ACW games all have some common DNA, but they were distinct enough that you couldn't jump right from one to another. For that reason, we asked him if he could design a game system that would synthesize these ideas into a core rule set for future titles. And the result is the American Civil War Operational Series. The first title is Our God Was My Shield, covering the Shenandoah Valley campaign. Each turn represents 1 day. Each hex spans 4.9 miles. Infantry have a movement factor of 2. 2 hexes a day in clear terrain. A little under 10 miles. If you begin and end the move away from the enemy, you can force march, moving twice that, about 20 miles. Do it on a road, 30 miles, 6 hexes. There are a lot of turns in the game. The shortest scenario runs 25 turns and the longest 56. But each turn is a snapshot. Each move is less about itself and more about what it threatens or promises a turn or 2 hence. The enemy edges 2 hexes closer, and from that you try and guess their intentions. And maybe even they don't know for sure. And even 2 or 4 hexes per turn is too strenuous a pace to maintain for long. Every 7 days you're required to perform a rest turn. No attacks, no forced marching, movement factors halved. But fail to fulfill that requirement and you suffer penalties which can compound over time as your men get more and more exhausted. Wars are fought by human beings with human limitations. They're also fought with materiel. The supply rules in Our God Was My Shield are not complex. In fact, they only come into play when you're trying to recover from disruption. If you're more than 15 movement points from your supply base, you get a +2 modifier to your recovery roll. Units recover on a 1, 2, or 3, so a +2 on top of a d6 can hamper you significantly. And so when a formation gets disrupted, when it gets hit hard, it's going to need to fall back towards the supply source in order to put itself back together again. Disrupted units can attack, and they defend at half their strength. A disrupted force that didn't perform required rest turns can't force march, making them a juicy and vulnerable target. And if they can't get into supply range to recover because you've captured their supply depot, well, no one said the game needed to run the full 25 turns. Jackson has 3 infantry units. Now, there are some optional reinforcements in the long scenario. You have some cavalry units under Ashby. You can create detachments from the main force. And then there's Branch, who is restricted to a corner of the map that doesn't see much action. But essentially, you have 3 units: Jackson, Ewell, and Johnson, with 11 strength points between them. And for most of the game, the Union has 3 as well: Banks, and then Milroy and Blenker, bearing in from the west under Fremont's command. More than halfway through the game, Shields and Ord were marching from the east. Altogether, a total of 25 strength points. So for Jackson, the trick, of course, is to defeat the enemy in detail, striking before their forces can converge. And that converging isn't easy. As I said, Shields and Ord show up pretty late. Banks is outnumbered at first and hesitant to move south, while Fremont's forces advance at a snail's pace. Remember that rule I told you about, where you can move twice your movement factor if you force march? Yeah, Fremont can't do that, not unless you play a special event card. To top it off, Fremont's supply source is a long ways from the action. You're going to be out of range by the time you encounter any butternuts, so cross your fingers that you don't get disrupted. Jackson, by contrast, is never far from his primary supply source, so long as it doesn't get captured anyway. The game clearly and cleanly demonstrates the advantages of interior lines and centralized command, advantages that were crucial to the outcome of the Valley campaign. But that outcome isn't inevitable. In the end, it comes down to your ability to come to grips with the enemy. And there, really, Banks and Fremont are as good as Jackson or Ewell. You don't get a column shift one way or the other because your uniform is blue or gray. You don't inflict extra casualties just because Jackson was celebrated and Banks reviled. It's not about Jackson and Banks. It's about you and your opponent, your wits, your nerve, your decisions. What was it they used to put on the Avalon Hill boxes? Now you are in command? Like all ad copy, it's more than a little silly. Perhaps horrifically so, given the monstrousness of war. But John's games come closer than most to the spirit of that ad copy. And that's why we're awfully glad that we published them.